From 1943 to 1946, more than 20,000 women in France were accused of collaborating with the occupiers and had their hair cut. This was the punishment for helping the enemy, showing sympathy for Nazi Germany, or simply sleeping with the Germans, which was called horizontal collaboration. The public punishment of women gave every Frenchman a sense of closure, signaling the end of the occupation and the return of their freedom. It was the most visible way to move past the shameful past and forget it as soon as possible. However, at times, these ceremonies were not politically motivated. Women were forcibly shaved in towns where German garrisons were not stationed during the war, and there were no collaborators or members of the resistance. This gave the town authorities a chance to assert their power over women. While men were also shaved bald for looting and informing, it is interesting to note that none of the French were punished for engaging in intimate relations with German women. In 1940, France suffered a resounding defeat in the war with Germany and was forced to capitulate. The German troops occupied the northern part of the country, which accounted for 60% of the French territory. They also occupied Paris, causing the new French government to move to the German-free resort town of Vichy. You may wonder why Hitler did not immediately occupy the entire country. The answer is simple. The French government had the option to evacuate to their colonies in North Africa and continue the war, relying on their still powerful navy. This was something that Hitler wanted to avoid. The elderly Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain led the defeated country. In October 1940, he addressed the French on the radio, urging them to cooperate with Germany. Marshal Pétain even went to pay homage to Hitler and obeyed all his orders. The French government assisted the German military machine by providing raw materials and sending young Frenchmen to work in German factories. Germany was in no hurry to sign a peace treaty, and the French had to bear the cost of the occupation administration. They paid for the maintenance of German garrisons on their territory, the construction of military airfields, and submarine bases operating in the Atlantic. The French paid about 20 million Reichsmarks a day, which included the occupation troops and the punitive organs like the Gestapo and security police. Despite their dislike of the Germans, many Frenchmen willingly joined their service. Most of the French were just conformists who willingly submitted to any authority. However, the Pétain government's vile sentiments prevailed in Vichy, including anti-communism, anti-Semitism, hatred of the Republic, and atheists, which transformed into sympathy for fascism. Around 20,000 French volunteers joined the SS division Charlemagne, and some of them were awarded the Iron Cross for their exploits on the Eastern Front. A legion of French volunteers against Bolshevism was formed in Vichy, which went to fight with the Wehrmacht against the Red Army. Neighbors were vigilant and watchful of each other. During the occupation, noise, music, and laughter were almost always perceived as betrayal. One Frenchman indignantly told about his neighbor. The Germans poured champagne on her and then, laughing, licked the droplets from her body. Perhaps this happened in all countries that surrendered to the enemy. As one writer put it, "We belong to those Frenchmen who slept with Germany, and the memories of this act are pleasant." It was believed that the German soldiers deliberately sought to sleep with as many French women as possible, because that was the policy of the occupation authorities. In reality, the Wehrmacht command was concerned about the spread of sexually transmitted diseases and tried to limit the intimate life of soldiers to prostitutes who worked under control. In the Paris area alone, German soldiers were served by 31 brothels. Another 5,000 prostitutes worked individually on a permanent basis, and about 100,000 French women traded their bodies from time to time. After the liberation of France, prostitutes were treated differently in different cities. Some were forgiven because they were just earning a living, while others were accused of collaborating with the enemy. Even during the occupation, they were obliged to show patriotism and serve only the French. If a French woman slept with a German, it was interpreted as a betrayal after her release. By themselves, intimate relations did not mean betrayal and did not pose any danger to France and the French. However, such a point of view was adopted. Every woman who lived with a German betrayed her homeland in her soul. Horizontal collaboration was the most unbearable sign of defeat and occupation. It was a metaphor for complete submission to Germany, which had defeated France. Hitler said in a narrow circle, "The French appear to be small townsfolk who once, due to many coincidences, gained some semblance of greatness. And let no one condemn me for holding the following point of view in relation to France. What's mine now is mine. I will not give up what I took by right of the strongest." After the British troops, along with some French units, began fighting against the Wehrmacht in North Africa on November 11, 1942, the Germans occupied the whole of France. The occupation of the northern part of the country after the defeat in the war was perceived as inevitable. But when the Germans occupied the previously unoccupied southern part of the country after more than 2 years, the French took it very painfully. Italy took control of part of the territory. Benito Mussolini, following Germany, also declared war on France and received his share. The military economy of the Reich flourished due to the slave labor of millions of concentration camp prisoners and the forced labor brought from the occupied territories. The Third Reich's General Commissioner for Labor Reserves, Fritz Sauckel, who needed 350,000 workers in 1942, signed an agreement with the French government. On September 4th, the Vichy government established compulsory labor service. All the French of military age had to go to work in Germany, but young French people did not want to go to the Reich. Those who managed to elude the Germans and their own police left their homes and hid in the woods. This was the beginning of the resistance movement. Most just hid in the woods until the Allies arrived. The brave joined combat detachments and established cooperation with the British. The black list of the resistance included prostitutes who served German soldiers, women who had relationships with Germans, and those who openly sympathized with Germany. For the first time, women were publicly humiliated by members of the resistance in June 1943. This was reported by the underground press. It was not only a punishment, but also a warning to the rest of the women. It is dangerous to collaborate with the Germans, and you will have to pay for it with tears, if not with blood. A woman who once drank coffee with German soldiers was also humiliated, as it was considered evidence of collaboration with the enemy. French women who give themselves to the Germans will have their hair cut, warned leaflets distributed by the resistance. We will write on your back, sold to the Germans. We must vaccinate ourselves against the diabolical temptation of collaboration and the fifth column virus. When young French women sell their bodies to the Gestapo or the police, they betray the blood and soul of their French compatriots. As future wives and mothers, they were obliged to preserve their purity in the name of love for the motherland. The liberation of the country began on June 6, 1944, when American and British troops landed in Normandy. The fighting in France lasted for several months. German troops in Paris surrendered on August 25, 1944. The French were unhappy because they lost the war and even cooperated with the occupiers. They craved solace, and General Charles de Gaulle came to their aid. He created a myth that the French people as a whole participated in the resistance. Paris has been liberated by French hands, Charles de Gaulle said solemnly, with the help of all France, real France, eternal France. A grand celebration was held on the occasion of the liberation. Joining the winning countries allowed the French to regain self-confidence and restore self-esteem. It was a sweet deliverance from humiliation and shame, a return to a new and pure life. The French needed to decisively and visibly break with the past. They wanted to express their feelings in some unusual way. When people saw women with their hair cut off, they were convinced that justice had prevailed. For many, it was not only revenge and the restoration of justice, but also the purification of the whole society. 2 laws adopted by the Consultative Assembly on August 24 and September 26, 1944, established the responsibility of those who provided assistance to Germany and its allies, threatened national unity, the rights and equality of all French citizens. They created special courts that tried the cases of those accused of collaboration. Sometimes there was lynching. Gestapo informants were dragged out of prison cells and executed in public. Someone used a favorable moment to settle long-standing accounts. But it was impossible to get to the already arrested Gestapo agent. He was behind bars, so men took out their anger on women who were accused of selling themselves to German soldiers. They cut their hair on their heads and drove them through the streets. British and American soldiers were surprised and outraged by what they were doing to women, considered it sadism, and told the crowd, "Let them go, for God's sake! You are all collaborators yourself!" They did not understand the feelings and experiences of the French, who had just been liberated from the occupation. For the local authorities, the haircut of women was proof that they had already begun to clean up their territory from the enemies of the people. The crowd raged. No pity for those who gave their body and soul to the Germans. But the courts did not give more than 8 days of imprisonment to women accused of intimate relations with the enemy. Moreover, they were obliged to visit a venereologist twice a week for 6 months, together with registered prostitutes. One can imagine what the partisans and underground workers thought about those who never joined them while the Germans were here, and now proudly declared their participation in the resistance. Cleaning became the common cause that united everyone. A woman with a shaved head was put as a symbol of liberation and the end of the occupation. The public massacre of the enemy raised the partisans in the eyes of the crowd, created a heroic halo for them. But it also united everyone, both those who fought with the enemy and those who watched what was happening from the side. Former police officers who performed Gestapo assignments now tried to associate themselves with the resistance. Participating in the punishment of women seemed the most obvious way to show their loyalty to the new government. It was the easiest and safest way to fit into the circle of winners, to punish unarmed and defenseless women. Real partisans were least willing to blame women. A woman gave a few hours of happiness to a German soldier. It is unpleasant for us that it was our compatriot, but in general, this did not affect the course of the war in any way. People were sure that by cutting women's hair, they thereby demonstrated their courage, and the crowd watched the fascinating spectacle with pleasure. In some cases, French women managed to justify themselves by presenting a certificate of virginity. This indicated that they could not possibly have an intimate relationship with the enemy. In some cases, the accused were sent to a gynecologist for examination. The presence of venereal disease was proof of horizontal collaboration. After the war, women's wigs jumped in price. Wigs, hats, scarves, turbans helped to hide the shame, but not to get rid of the humiliation suffered. Some women could not bear the shame and passed away. Others ended up in the hospital with a serious nervous breakdown. It all depended on the character and psyche. There were also those who kept their composure and filed complaints, proving that they were accused in vain. The advancing German troops captured 1,600,000 French soldiers in 1940. Half were married, 1 in 4 had children at home. Most of the prisoners of war spent the entire war in captivity and returned home only in April 1945. Here, a new disappointment awaited them. It was difficult, and sometimes impossible, to establish a married life. 1 in 10 got divorced almost immediately. There was almost always one reason: adultery. It was impossible to hide it. The neighbors did not miss the opportunity to open the eyes of the husband who returned home. While the husbands were at the front, and then in captivity, the women had to take care of the children and the house, and remain faithful to their men. On the one hand, when women earned and fed their children themselves, they were treated with respect. On the other hand, by becoming independent, they violated the patriarchal traditions and norms of a conservative society. They became independent, which men did not like at all. They were looked at with caution. They allowed themselves unthinkable things, including choosing partners themselves. Men understood that the defeat in the war and the occupation were the result of their inability to fulfill their duty, protect the country, and save women from the invasion of the enemy. Liberation became an opportunity to regain one's manhood. This was the return of the traditional male role of a warrior. The French wanted to get even with Nazism for everything that had been done to them over the years. Personal vendetta and the desire for justice, the desire to punish the enemies of the country and get rid of someone you hate, mixed up. The hatred that has been accumulating since the surrender has splashed out on the women. Now the French reproached their wives, sisters, and daughters for allowing themselves to have fun with the Germans while their men were kept in prison camps or labor camps. The shaved head was a visible proof of the guilt of women in front of French men, like the image of a lily, which in former times branded the shoulders of prostitutes. But it was already impossible to stop the process of emancipation of women. In April 1944, the Consultative Assembly of France, still sitting in colonial Algeria, granted French women the right to vote. In the spring of 1945, women participated in local government elections for the first time. All this happened at a time when French women were getting their hair cut all over the country. The first post-war Minister of Justice reported to the Consultative Assembly that the courts had sentenced 3 920 collaborators to death, 1,500 to hard labor, and 8,500 to prison. But General Charles de Gaulle was the first to decide that there was no need to stir up the past and divide the country into traitors and heroes. The unity of the nation is much more important. The trials of the collaborators were completed in July 1949. More than 1,000 convicts were pardoned by President de Gaulle. But for the rest, the prison sentence was short-lived. In 1953, an amnesty was declared. By law, former collaborators cannot even be reminded of their service to the occupiers. Thank you so much for watching this video to the end. I am very pleased to read your comments. Please make sure you subscribe to my channel and like it.